Hello and welcome to our December Syxsense Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look on the new Patch Tuesday release. Please save all of your questions till the end, and we'll have a specialist reach out to answer those.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the final Patch Tuesday of 2022. We are delighted for you to join us today to discuss the fixes released by Microsoft this month. I'm Rob Brown, and I'm Head of Customer Success. And over the last decade, we've deployed over 100 million patches to our managed services customers around the globe. We're going to discuss today how we prioritize the patches based on the risk they pose to an environment in order that you can design your own strategy that is right for you. So first thing, we're going to go to some news because there is some very important news that we need to discuss first. The warning. Microsoft didn't release any preview updates in December. The preview updates usually are released in the first Tuesday of the month, but there weren't any this month, probably because of the Christmas period. The issue, though, with not releasing preview updates is that many IT admins do subscribe to the preview updates, and Microsoft used the feedback from those IT admins in order to test the robustness of the fixes that are released in the month after. So if they don't have the testing that they usually have from those users that subscribe to that program this month, in January, you will find that there will be less testing than we usually expect. And that means that the patches that are released in January may have to go through a more robust testing process, because you potentially will be finding things that simply haven't been observed in the wider environment. And that's one of the risks, of course, with relying on Microsoft alone for testing patches. There does need to be an extra level of testing. Now, the preview updates are not supported by Microsoft, so if you do observe an issue, you can send the messages to Microsoft for their help desk to address those issues, which is why we don't recommend that you deploy preview updates to your live environment, because they're untested, and if you have issues, they must be uninstalled. So just a warning, what takes place in January should include much more thorough testing than what you may have been doing so until now. If you require any assistance on a testing strategy, please get in contact. We do have several white papers to document a very effective, very simple testing process, just to make sure that the testing is done so that when you deploy your patches, you don't end up causing too much end user disruption. We also have this month the end of 21H1. It actually reached its end of life yesterday. There are no more updates now released after December. So until the end of this month, if there is an outer band, potentially it will be released for 21H1. But from January going forward, that operating system and that feature update is now end of life. Please be aware, if you have the 21H1 still in your environment, it is essential that you upgrade it to the latest or to a version that is in support. And what we are recommending is 22H2. Also, a week ago, we had Google Chrome version 108 was released to fix a weaponized bug for Windows, Mac, and Linux and Android. And that would be the 9th or 10th weaponized release from Google, slightly less than last year. In fact, maybe half as many as what we had last year. So it's Google clearly have done a better job testing their browser. However, because Google is a third party, it's not released officially via the Microsoft Windows Update. So if you don't have a third-party patching solution, then you need to add something to your patching strategy if you're using Windows Update or WSUS alone. Now, 10 days ago, we had an out-of-band update from Microsoft, KB 501-9966. That was released to address an issue, but after its release, there were a lot of users reporting memory leaks. Now, Microsoft did release a superseded patch, a super session patch for that, which is KB 502.1.237. However, we are aware that a lot of companies don't always deploy the latest patches, and this memory leak is actually very serious. If you adopt a patch 1 month behind strategy, meaning that you're always deploying 1 month patches, there is in fact a workaround. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring across the Microsoft link that we've put on our news page, which actually lists what you can do to work around the issue of the memory leak caused by the November patch. So over at learn.microsoft.com, just take a search for the November 2022 KB 502.1.237, and you'll find this page. And this page lists the registry key that you can add that will effectively stop the memory leak. Now, what they're also saying is very important is that once you have the KB installed that effectively mitigates this workaround, then you should be removing this registry key. You shouldn't leave it in place. You, in fact, should restore the key to your backup. So whatever was beforehand, it should be restored. Or if you actually didn't have this registry key and it was created, then it should be deleted. And that is actually best practice. So if you are using something like Syxsense and you do search for the memory leak, then actually you can add the registry key, and when it's time to install the KB that replaces it, you can then remove the registry key. It's completely up to you. But that is a very important workaround, because domain controllers specifically, if they actually run out of memory, they could end up crashing. And what they're suggesting is it may automatically restart. And if you automatically restart, that could impact your users when they try to log on to the domain. Okay, now if we forward to yesterday's Patch Tuesday release, we had a rather small list of fixes. In fact, it's the smallest of the entire year. We had 52 fixes, 6 critical, 43 were important, and 3 were moderate. And what is interesting is that some of those moderates are actually some of the highest priority for you to address. Windows 7 and Windows 2008 also had fixes. In fact, Windows 7, this will be almost the second to last month that you will receive fixes, because that now goes to end of life, even with the year 3 extension. It had 15 fixes, which were 3 critical, 11 important, and 1 moderate, and 2008 had exactly the same. If we take the list of all of the 52 fixes, we had 5 that were what we call a jump point, and we'll talk more about that very soon. But last month, we also had 5 jump points. So the proportion of jump points this month is actually much higher. And we'll talk about why jump points are actually very, very serious. We had 1 weaponized and 1 public aware, which was much lower than what we had last month. So what we're going to do is talk about how we're going to prioritize, because we don't just choose the severity of the vendor only. We need to offer a robust selection or calculation of the patches to show you which ones you should be deploying more urgently than others. And since COVID, obviously it's been in the back of our mind now, but since COVID, those days where you could deploy everything over fast networks sort of left. And you now have to be very efficient with the selection process to ensure that you're deploying the most critical ones you can in the quickest period of time before you move to the other patches. Some of the cumulative updates from Microsoft are in excess of 1.5 gigabytes. So it's very important that you choose the right cumulative updates, the right severity of fixes over the others when you potentially have multiple binaries that you have to deploy. So you want to make sure that you're being very efficient to remediate as fast as possible. And we do that with 6 factors. We call this a 6 score. The first factor is the vendor severity. Of course, we use the vendor severity. They came up with the original severity, so we use it. That typically is from critical to high, medium or moderate and low, and sometimes they have a severity of NA, but it's from most critical to least critical. CVSS is an independent assigned score from 10 to 0. And when I say independent, it is actually an independent organization. It's not a private company that they have a very sophisticated calculator that is able to work out the true risk of a vulnerability based on multiple factors, such as if an attacker requires physical access to a device in order to exploit, then that is less risky than if a device requires internet access and can be exploited. Obviously, that's more risky. Now, we combine the two. So we take the vendor severity and the CVSS score, and we combine the two, and it gives us an average risk of severity for that particular fix. We also have a state of that vulnerability. Weaponized means that it's been recognized industry-wide that someone is exploiting it. So that has no connection to the severity at all, but the weaponization of a vulnerability makes it more serious. So even though some vulnerabilities are released with a lower severity, a lower score, when they become weaponized, they become more serious. So we use the weaponized status as a way of calculating that into the risk. Public aware means that the precise blueprint to exploit is on the internet. It has been published. Maybe this was a bug bounty program, or maybe this is just an ethical hacker that is making a YouTube video, but the precise method to exploit does exist. And if you have the precise blueprint to exploit, that also increases the risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that something that's public aware becomes weaponized. In fact, maybe only 5% of vulnerabilities that are weaponized are in fact public aware. But it still is a risk. You don't want to be an IT manager that knew that something was publicly available to exploit, and you didn't deploy it because it was a medium severity or it was a low severity. So it's very important that we take that into consideration as well. Now, just like we can't deploy every single patch everywhere all the time, we have countermeasures that help us to counteract the risk. If we have a countermeasure, such as a registry key or a service that we can stop, we can do that much quicker than we can deploying a 1.5 gigabyte payload. We call that a workaround. So if there's a workaround, then you should think about applying the workaround whilst you prepare for the deployment of the patch. And if that is the case, then the solution you're using, the vulnerability or patch solution you're using, may be able to help you to deploy those workarounds much faster. So you can effectively mitigate the vulnerability before you apply the patch. And maybe you have a mitigation in place. So, for example, you may have a high a highly advanced antivirus. And that highly advanced antivirus can actually help you to mitigate the vulnerability. If you have a countermeasure, we balance the score. So if everything is very serious, but there is a countermeasure, it kind of makes it a little bit less serious. And of course, everything is factored into your exposure. So what we've done is we've put everything onto our Syxsense website. The news page will list every vulnerability by CVE. Pop those into your solution, and the vulnerabilities that are most detected based on the severity, the score, the weaponized, and the public aware should be the ones that you deploy first. Exposure is very important, that you're not choosing patches that are weaponized if you don't have many devices in your environment vulnerable for it. But if you have a vulnerability that is severity critical, CVSS score 10, but not yet weaponized, then that should probably be your priority for patching first before you work on the weaponized second. So let's take a look at our website. Now, if you head over to, if you're familiar with this format, we don't put these recommendations into the PowerPoint. We actually do publish our Patch Tuesday article on the Tuesday. So it's available straight away. So on our website, you've actually got access to our resources section here. And if you come down to our news page or the Patch Tuesday links, there are direct links to our resources. If you have any questions at all, you can actually go ahead and use the chat function down here to talk to any of our techies. Or if you actually would like to try using Syxsense to see how it may help you to patch your environment, you can use the schedule my demo button there, pop in your details. Now, what we have on our resources page, as I mentioned, we have a Patch Tuesday link, and it will take you directly to the Patch Tuesday page. And from here, if you want, we can actually subscribe you to our emails, so that every time we pop up one of these articles, you actually will get a copy of that email. So as I mentioned, we've got 52 fixes this month. It's much, much smaller. It's the smallest of the entire year, which is actually really good as we come into the Christmas period. But those fixes do include quite a large Microsoft operating system components, Microsoft Azure, sys internals, even Microsoft Edge, SharePoint, .NET Framework. They all had updates this month. Now, if your company offers a change freeze or has a change freeze for the month of December, I totally understand if you don't want to prioritize some of these updates. However, some of them I'm going to recommend, please make sure that you deploy them as soon as you can, because they're very, very serious. So my first recommendation is CVE 2022-44698. This is a Windows Smart Screen security feature bypass vulnerability. And what is interesting is this is the second month that we've had this particular vulnerability fixed. So this is the second month in a row, and we hadn't seen one of these actually for the whole of the year. This particular vulnerability is a mark of the web vulnerability. Now, mark of the web is a file status. So when you download something from the internet, it marks the file with a flag that can tell the operating system and applications running on your PC that this is from the internet. Now, if you can somehow remove that flag or create a vulnerability that hides that status from the operating system, then it is then possible to infect that system with that file. And certain applications within Windows actually do not allow these files to be run unless you go ahead and explicitly allow them. If you can remove that flag, then the operating system doesn't know that this was actually from the web, such as protected view in the Microsoft Office platform. Now, interesting enough, the vendor severity is important. That's very important actually, because it's not critical and the CVSS is only 5.4, but it is being used in weaponized attacks right now. It can attack across any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges. It does require the end user to click a button or to click a link in an email. If your users are properly trained, that might reduce the risk to your environment. But if there's potential for them to click that link, then this is actually a very serious vulnerability. But luckily, there is no jump point for this. So it is our top pick because it is weaponized. And the risk to your environment, should you accidentally click a link and have a file, that file could be ransomware. That file could be anything. So it is the top pick for this month. The next is CVE 2022 44710. This is a DirectX graphics kernel elevation of privilege vulnerability. Now, this particular vulnerability only impacts Windows 11, but we do know that a lot of customers of ours have moved to Windows 11. So it has become the more prominent operating system. Now, this is an elevation of privilege vulnerability, which means that if the attacker can win a race condition, they can effectively run the process under system privileges. And from there, they can do whatever they want. So the risk is incredibly high. This is the vulnerability that's been made public aware. Its vendor severity is important. Again, another vulnerability that doesn't actually have one of those critical severities. Its CVSS is 7.8, which is pretty high. It is weaponized, it is not weaponized, but it is public aware. There's no countermeasure at all for this, so you only have the option of deploying this patch. It does require local access, so you can't access it over the internet, but across a local LAN, it is possible. Attack complexity is high, and all that means is that it needs something else to run this process. But if you can run a process that runs this process, the attack complexity actually doesn't matter. Low privileges and no user interaction. And as we mentioned, this is actually one of the jump points. Now, a jump point is where a vulnerability coming through and exploited can then launch another code or another operating system function outside of that original vulnerability. So this particular vulnerability is DirectX on the graphics kernel. They potentially could jump out of that into another architecture inside Windows, maybe a command shell or maybe even PowerShell. The opportunity to jump is endless. But once that jump has happened, then you're now inside the operating system doing something that you can't track. So with regards to the SolarWinds, when that attack happened, they were able to jump inside the operating system. They left breadcrumbs. So the original vulnerability, in this case, the DirectX, if they could leave another hole where they could access that system because of the jump point flag, now, even if you went and resolved this vulnerability for DirectX, they still have access to your system. That is why a jump point is so serious that actually everything that is a jump point should be remediated as urgently as possible. And my third is CVE 2022 41076. This is a PowerShell remote code execution vulnerability. And even if you're an environment that blocks PowerShell, the binaries that are on your system could still be exploited. So although Microsoft is saying that this is likely to be exploited, there isn't actually any evidence of it being exploited at this point. This does have a jump point. So if you can exploit this, just as I mentioned, you can jump sideways inside the operating system. This has a vendor severity of critical, a CVSS of 8.5. It is not weaponized or public aware at the moment, but it has no countermeasure. So you have to deploy this update. Okay, now this particular vulnerability can be attacked across your network, including the internet. It does have attack complexity of high, which means that something has to launch the payload. It's not a direct vulnerability, a direct attack that has to take place. It's something that has to be launched once they're in. Privileges are low, user interaction is none, but this jump point does exist. And as I mentioned previously, we've gone and put all of the fixes down here. So this is the CVE reference for all of the vulnerabilities in the order in which I recommend that you check your systems management toolset. Take this reference, pop it into your toolset. If you are vulnerable for any of them, especially the top 10 in this list, then those are the ones that you should be deploying above the others. There is a lot of additional information here against them, even though I haven't chose them in my top 3. There are some very useful information here under additional details to help you justify why you are recommending to your security admins and to your security leadership why you are deploying these updates. And as I mentioned, if anyone has any questions, if there is any request for testing strategies, deployment strategies, use the chat function to send us a message, and we'd love to hear your feedback from this webinar. If you need any support at all, we're here to help, and we hope that you're able to keep yourself safe. From everyone at Syxsense, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'd love your feedback. Please send us an email, info@syxsense.com. Let us know how we may improve these webinar series going forward. We hope you have a wonderful December, a lovely Christmas, and until January, happy patching.